Merit matters, and no dumbest bill in America. This is Mark Fisher with Mark and the Millennials, and the Millennial. Joining me today is, of course, Christopher Hopkins, our producer. Welcome, everyone, to this podcast titled Merit Matters. But first, before we talk about merit today, and we're talking about merit in all aspects of our society, including and especially in education, higher education, and of course, K-12. But before we go there, we have an update on a story that was reported yesterday by Tucker Carlson, and only Tucker Carlson. I actually haven't seen this story reported by NBC, by CBS, not by CBS, not by NBC, not by ABC, not by CNN, and not by MSNBC. Think about that. None of the outlets, the major news outlets in the United States of America, have reported on the story of the drag queen groomer performing in front of children and adults. Now, Tucker Carlson spoke about this last night, and he did report about it. And I thought he did an amazing job, a terrific job, by the way, because if for no other reason, he was willing to talk about it. I just think it's fascinating that we can't even have this conversation where you have an adult dressed up as a different sex or a different gender and then performs in front of children. And it is organized, this performance. It's not as though the drag queen just walked into the store or to the restaurant and started performing. They're like, oh, excuse me, sir, or I mean, ma'am, please, you can't do that in here. This is a restaurant and you have to be a patron. That is to say, you actually have to be purchasing food and then sitting down and eating the food. You're not really here to perform. We did not hire you to do that. That's not, that kind of thing. No, these are actually organized. These events are actually organized. And that's what's so fascinating about it. And so, ladies and gentlemen, here's the takeaway now. We're telling you this story because there's an update. And the update is that the Texas Attorney General has called for the prosecution over the drag queen's sexually explicit performance in front of a child. So the Texas AG is like, this dude needs to be prosecuted. We need to send a message because he is, and it's a guy dressed up as a woman. He is sexualizing a child and doing things that would never be allowed. I mean, Chris, our millennial and our producer, brought up a point earlier. And what was the point about this, Chris? Like, you can't...
Just that I think it's a law to show sexually, regardless of the gender thing, it's against the law to show sexually explicit material to minors.
Great, exactly. Yes. So interestingly enough, there is an adult recently, Chris, in my home state who was an appointed official in state government by an elected governor. Mm-hmm. So the individual is in a very high position. And that individual was trading in, not charging for, but trading in sexually explicit photos of minors. And that individual is now in prison.
Good.
So to your point, and this is an interesting millennial perspective, by the way, because, the millennial perspective is I don't have an issue with the drag queen performing in an adults only club.
Which I don't.
Because, and by the way, I don't either, because it's an adults only club and you as an adult don't need to go there and ought not go there if you don't want to see that. It's a lot different when you're an adult and you bring your child or your child is required to go there. And your point is that, so that's the first point of the millennial. The second point is that you actually can't show photographs about minors that are in sexually explicit photos. You can't share them. You can't possess them. And so then why are you allowed then to pose yourself in front of minors in a sexually explicit way? And I think that, right?
always thought the law for that, if you wanted to view that kind of thing in a club or something, you have to be 18 or of age.
Yeah. It's like, sorry, sir, you can't come in here unless you're 18 or 21. Some places are 21 for obvious reasons, because, as you know, nationwide the drinking age is 21. So it's like, since we serve alcohol, we don't want you to come in here unless you're 21. Other places, I presume maybe there was more leeway. You could be 18 or older.
You have to be a certain age for sure.
You have to be a certain age for sure. Exactly. So here's where we're going with this, ladies and gentlemen. We're trying to get to that point in America, at least here at Mark and the Millennials, where we can start convincing states' attorneys across the United States and attorney generals across the United States to begin prosecuting individuals who choose to perform and or include children to perform in front of those individuals. When there's a child involved, ought to be prosecuted. Okay, I want to make it very clear what I'm saying here. The individual is an adult. This trans individual, they want to perform in a club somewhere, and it's an adults-only club, 21 and older. That's fine. That's their choice. Okay, it's a free society. Have at it, right? Key West. there you go. It's all over Key West and elsewhere. These are adults. They get to choose to live the way they want and perform in these clubs. It's an entirely different thing to bring in a child and or intentionally include children and engage in literally sexualizing and sexual acts and dancing in front of the children while you're dressed in drag. I mean, talk about confusing for the poor children. So I think that's the linkage and the nexus we're trying to create here. It's like, okay, well, there's a nexus between doing that in front of a child, and that same nexus exists with distributing pornography, because isn't it the same thing? You can't distribute child pornography for good reason, obviously a very good law. And we have this gentleman in Maryland who's serving prison time because of it. And these people I know exist across the country. So how is there not a nexus between that and this individual in Texas performing in front of children and saying what he's saying and dancing in the way that he's dancing? And my hope here is that more states' attorneys and attorney generals across the country will begin to do the right thing and to start cracking down on this, and that state legislatures across the country. And I really do believe this is a state issue, state by state issue, but state legislatures should also weigh in on this matter. Why would any state legislature not want to pass a bill that says that children ought not be exposed to this kind of nonsense, and that it ought to be, and then if they are exposed to it, the individual performing ought to be charged. So back to the story. So we have this Texas Attorney General who's decided that he's going to prosecute this individual. And before we go to the story, I want you to listen to the clip, ladies and gentlemen. This is important, okay? Because while it may be so that Tucker Carlson played this clip last night, he bleeped out the words. We're not going to bleep out the words. I want you to hear this. And I want to describe to you before you hear it that the individual is pushing out his buttocks and then lifts up his dress and shows what looks like some sort of extra string where his crotch is. And of course, he's dressed as a woman. It's a drag queen, but it's a dude. Every aspect of what this individual does is what a groomer would do before basically taking advantage of your child. And then right behind the drag queen, this individual is a young girl. At least she's the only one that I can see there, but there are other children that are there. And she appears to me to be about 5 or 6 years old. In other words, she is not just a child, but she's looking with great fear and confusion in her eyes at what is transpiring in front of her. And if you're listening to the podcast, obviously you can't see this, but we made it a point to say, okay, are there any children in this audience? And yes, there are. And there's one literally in plain view of the video a 5 or 6-year-old child who looks absolutely frightened and confused about what is happening. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to play this clip for you, and here it is.
My pussy good, pussy sweet, pussy good enough to eat. Pussy good, pussy sweet, pussy good enough to eat. My pussy good, pussy sweet, pussy good enough to eat. Pussy good, pussy sweet, pussy good enough to eat. Tight pussy, right pussy, fuck me all night. Pussy make you leave your wife. Pussy cuff is what you like. Pussy high and on your pipe. Pussy ride you like a bike. Pussy do whatever you ask it to. I'm now.
So that is your left today, ladies and gentlemen. These are what we call the left wing of America today. These are the progressives. These are the people that aren't satisfied with transgenders performing in clubs where it's indoors and you have to be of a certain age. You have to be an adult to get in. No, these left-wingers, these progressives, have decided that they want to bring that into the public school setting, or if they can't get it into the public school setting, they want to have these kinds of events in your local small businesses and invite children to them. This is your left wing today. These are your progressives today. And who among us wouldn't watch this and listen to this and say to ourselves, at least as it relates to our children, don't you feel like this cloak of evil has descended upon the country when you see stuff like this? I mean, look, I want to clarify what I'm saying here. You want to go to a drag show? Go to a drag show. I don't care. It's a show. Be an adult, show your ID, get in because you're 21 years of age or older. That's your business. But including the children, I don't get it. So the Texas AG agrees. And here's the story in the Daily Caller. The Texas Attorney General, Ken Paxton, called for the prosecution over a sexually explicit drag performance in front of at least one child in exclusive comments to the Daily Caller News Foundation. And that was the child I was explaining to you earlier. It looked like a 5 or 6-year-old. A drag performer sang sexually explicit lyrics, simulated a sex act, and flashed underwear in front of children at all ages. Event Saturday in Plano, Texas. It's the responsibility of district and county attorneys to prosecute the inappropriate acts on display at the drag show, according to Paxton, who called on the state's legislature to add language to the penal code explicitly addressing this issue. Quote, "This is grotesque, disturbing behavior. Under Texas law, local district and county attorneys are charged with taking up the mantle to protect Texas kids by prosecuting these types of totally inappropriate acts," Paxton told the DC NF. What's more, in 2023, the Texas legislature should amend the Texas Penal Code to expressly prohibit this kind of grossly sexual conduct and empower my office to prosecute when district attorneys refuse, he said. The event in question featured a drag performer singing "My," basically P-U-S-S-Y, is good. And as you can imagine, "F me all night" was also said in front of a young girl while flashing underwear at the audience and simulating a sex act. Adults in the crowd cheered and threw money at the performer while the child watched quietly. I would add that the child was watching quietly, but also terrified and confused. So here's what's interesting. In blue states, and I can say this as a state legislature, and I think this is going to throw some pretty interesting insight into what's going on in our country. So I serve in the Maryland State House of Delegates, and I can tell you with 100% certainty that if I put a bill in, and the bill in the Maryland State Legislature that I put in said that an act such as this should be prosecuted under the criminal code. That is to say, an act such as this, meaning there is this sexually explicit behavior and language, that is being performed in front of minors. And in the event that happens, that the individual must be, emphasis on must, be charged with a crime and serve some time to send a message to the woke, crazy, out of control left who want to continue and put this into public education, ladies and gentlemen. Now, here is where, and by the way, I think every reasonable person out there that I know at least would think, that makes sense, Mark. Pretty easy. Pretty simple piece of, legislation. Should be pretty easy to get that through. And so here's what's interesting. If I were to put that bill in, if I were to draft that bill, enter that bill into the Maryland State Legislature, here's what happens. The bill then is assigned to a committee, and the committee has a public hearing. So then you call friends, and friends show up, and they testify for your bill, namely they want your bill to pass. I can guarantee you that the Democrats in the committee will make sure the bill is killed and not passed. I can guarantee you. And I'm talking about a very narrowly defined bill, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, a very narrowly defined bill that says that you will be charged with criminal activity if you are engaging in expressly sexual conduct and language such as this I'm talking about, like drag queen. And again, I'm not an attorney, but I'm pretty sure we can define this pretty clearly in front of minors. And of course, there's the whole other question about this particular video, which is like, what are the adults thinking when there's a child there, which we'll talk about in a minute. But my point is that in the blue state in which I live and where I serve, the Democrats would not let this bill pass. And so there's this unique thing in the legislature where when your bill doesn't pass, you can then, at the appropriate moment when you have an open session of the Maryland House of Delegates, and there is a bill being debated that is about, let's say, public education, for an example. And the bill is about adding more math curriculum to public education. In that particular case, on the House floor, when you were debating that bill, I could then add my bill as an amendment to that bill. In other words, I would have to stand up and say, Madam Speaker, I have an amendment that I would like to add to this bill. And the Madam Speaker asks you to read the amendment. You read the amendment, and then you describe what the amendment does. And then at that particular point, the same Democrats who killed your bill in the committee so that it never has an actual vote on it. Remember, in the committee, they don't even vote on it. They just like act, you get a public hearing, but there's never a vote. So they're not on record that they're against it, but they are against it because they kill it. But now you bring the same bill on the floor of the House and you try to amend curriculum in public school systems, and you say that this is strictly prohibited. That is to say, you can't have drag queen happy hour or drag queen hour in public school systems because it sexualizes children and it is inappropriate. And if so, here are the following penalties. And once again, the wording for that can be very clear and concise and very narrowly defined so as to make sure that, we're going after the people who are trying to sexualize children in the public school system. So remember, I'm narrowly defining this legislation, and the Democrats in the Maryland House of Delegates, when that amendment would be offered, would still vote against it. They would. They'd still vote against it. That is to say, they would come up with it's not happening. Here's their argument, because I hear it all the time. That's not happening in the public school system here. That doesn't happen. Remember, these are the same people that said in the legislatures across the country, critical race theory isn't being taught in our public school system. We don't have critical race theory here. Come on. You're making that up. And then you put a bill in or an amendment on the House floor and say critical race theory is prohibited because of the simple fact that it is in and of itself discrimination based on the way people look. And of course, they'll argue and vote against it. The Democrats will, the progressives will, because they'll say, well, it doesn't exist. So why would we even take this seriously? Because it's not even happening. They're going to say the same thing about this. It's not really happening. It's not happening. No, of course not. It's like inflation. There's no inflation. It's not happening. Don't worry. Don't look behind the curtain, Dorothy. So I think that the Texas Attorney General, Ken Paxton, will probably come up with some pretty solid and very focused and narrowly defined legislation for the Texas legislature when they meet to make sure that events like this, while they may happen and certainly are allowed to happen because we're a free society, they cannot happen with children. They must happen with adults who are 21 years of age or older. And I think that is a really fair way of approaching this because of the simple fact that and this is what blows me away, why isn't it enough for a dude dressed as a woman? Why isn't it enough for him just to perform in front of other adults? It's just, so there's that immediately, it's kind of like the overnight camping trip with the coach, Your kid comes home and says, "Hey, Mom, the coach wants to do an overnight camping trip." I thought, "Oh, okay, great." And your kid's, let's say, 14. And who else is going? "Oh, nobody, just me." Well, I mean, your antenna should go up. I'm pretty sure. Probably not a good idea. Just like, hey, Mom, I was invited to a show over at the drag club. Oh, yeah, who invited you? And why there? And your kid's 14. Well, this is even worse because it is a show that is held in a small private business in the community. So it's not a drag club. So I would assume, and it would not surprise me if many of the people were duped. Or who knows? Maybe they weren't. Maybe they're just into this. Look, here's the other part of the subject. And we have to discuss this. And that is, there are all these adults at the show, and they, for the most part, appear to be having a good time. Shouldn't they have culpability when there's a child present? I mean, a 5-year-old or 6-year-old child is there. At least that's at a minimum. At least one child that is there. I'm pretty sure there are others. But shouldn't there be something there as well? It's like, once again, we have a free society. You get to go to these clubs. You get to see these performers when you're an adult. But when you bring children in, that is where the line must be drawn. And good for you, Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, for bringing your foot down and actually trying to do something about it. I just think that there are so many people that are afraid to even touch this subject because they're like, oh, it's transgender. And since that's like the cool thing of the day and the left is all about it. No. I also want to give, big creds and call out to Tucker Carlson for actually being the only person on TV that I know of who's actually spoken about this on any network whatsoever. And I just want to read a couple of the comments in this story in the Daily Caller. So the skipper wrote just an hour ago, actually, it's another issue Democrats are underwater on. Remember, it took Obama 8 years to lose the 1,000 seats Democrats held in various state, local, and national positions. I see another big loss coming for them. Only quicker this time. Mr. X says, libs love to change the meaning of words. Let's all look at the dictionary definition of the word grooming. Quote, an act or instance of engaging in behaviors or practices intended to gradually condition or emotionally manipulate a victim over time, as through friendship, gifts, flattery, etc., in order to entrap the person in a sexually abusive or predatory relationship. The ongoing targeting and grooming of minors online shows that our safety protocols for children on the internet are insufficient. Well said. Tony Seco, this was obscene. There are laws against public obscenity and children were involved. I've proven that both of these statements are true. Game, set, match. Good day. And then last comment that I'm going to read because there are tons of them. The parents should be charged with child abuse too. This is perversion. If you're an adult, do what you want behind closed doors, but this is wrong. And I think that's probably, ladies and gentlemen, the general consensus. And that's what's so interesting about it. You know, the left is like, well, you're not woke, you're not cool, you're not like up to speed. It's like, you don't understand something, lefties out there, podcast listeners who are on the left side of the fence. I don't care what you do when you're an adult. I do care when there are children brought into it, when there are minors that are brought into it. That's the line. That is the line that you cross. And this is pretty clearly crossing it. No doubt about it. So next up, podcast listeners, diversity over merit, which is the subject of this podcast. And it's an interesting subject that so many people don't understand what has been happening in the public school systems and in the school boards across the country. So there was this concerted effort under the Obama administration and, you know, to be fair, Obama-Biden, but it started in the Obama administration to convince school boards and public education teachers that merit should be taken out of public school measurement. In other words, they wanted schools to get rid of the salutatorian and the valedictorian. In other words, don't recognize the people at the top because we can't reward excellence. So that started under Obama. And interestingly enough, I remember talking to teachers who would say to me, yeah, I think that's a good idea. I mean, these were teachers who were in the middle or right of center. And many of them, I didn't know what their political affiliation was anyway, and it didn't really matter because it was just it was a discussion about education. And I asked the teachers, what do you think about getting rid of the valedictorian and the salutatorian? Some of the teachers were like, I think it's the dumbest thing I've ever seen because we're already having issues with parents who want their kid to always be in the AP classes, the advanced classes, but they're not necessarily ready and so forth. And we want parents to understand that education is developmental, number one, and number two, you reward excellence. You don't reward mediocrity. And then other teachers would say to me, oh, I think it's great to get rid of that. It's just the best thing ever because I'm so tired of dealing with parents who think their kid's the smartest kid in the world and so forth, et cetera. It's just an interesting conversation. I always had a problem with it myself over a decade ago because, that is to say, of getting rid of the salutatorian and the valedictorian because of the fact that it seemed to me as though it was the beginning of a process to get rid of excellence in public schools. And sure enough, ladies and gentlemen, that is exactly what has happened, and it has accelerated. I had a hard time, to be honest with you, 10 years ago, fully articulating what I thought was going on, but I knew it didn't feel right. Like, why would we... Look, I remember the valedictorian in my school. He was wicked smart. And he ended up going to Harvard. All right? And that valedictorian, honestly, I mean, he had no life. I mean, he studied morning, night, and day, 7 days a week. And when he wasn't studying, he played lacrosse. And I'm sure that part of the reason he got into Harvard was because of lacrosse, because at that time, lacrosse wasn't like the big sport that it is today. It was very like at the beginning stages. But nonetheless, he sacrificed enormously to get to that point. And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, you know, there's always that little bit of jealousy when you're in high school. Oh, yeah, well, he's so smart because he studied all the time. But guess what? How dare he? How dare you? How dare you? But you know what? He deserved it. At the end of the day, you're like, yeah, okay, well, the guy's really smart. He also put in the work. It's very clear that he's number one in the class. He deserves to be number one in the class. Give it to him and recognize him for making those sacrifices. Same thing with the salutatorian. And then fast forward, we have this situation where you actually have some, emphasis on some teachers, who are like, I'm just tired of dealing with the parents because they're all arguing over whose kid is the smartest. And the thing is some of our grading is subjective and blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, then don't make grading subjective, right? I mean, since when is grading subjective? Okay, fine. English papers, maybe in some cases, creative writing. But come on, that's an important part of education, but it's a very small component of the overall educational process. It's usually pretty obvious who the smartest guy or girl is in the 12th grade. Just like it's very obvious who the smartest guy and or girl is in 8th grade or in 5th grade or in 1st grade. It's very, very clear to everybody they ought to be recognized. Why not? So here we are, fast forward to today, after the Obama administration started this process and began to hijack school boards by getting rid of and eliminating merit through the valedictorian and the salutatorian. And it is even permeated to colleges, where there's a college that won't place students who are studying to be teachers at any public school that prohibits the teaching of critical race theory. So think about this. Your kid goes to college to become a teacher. What a great profession to be a teacher. It is. It is a wonderful profession. Sometimes, and many times, it's thankless. So your kid goes off to college, and then the college is like, well, we're not going to place you in any public school system unless they teach critical race theory. And in other words, we want to get rid of merit. We don't want you to go to a school where you measure people by merit. Instead, we want you to measure them by the way they look. Oh, that's okay, Johnny. You misspelled virtually every word in your essay, but because you're black, I'm giving you an A. Not popular to say that, is it? But effectively, critical race theory teaches that there is no way that people can be educated in an equal way unless you engage in racism in the public school environment. And that's just the beginning of it. And this all started under Barack Obama, when he wanted to get rid of merit in public education, namely recognizing the valedictorian and the salutatorian. So California State University Fullerton will not be placing new student teachers at Placentia Yorba Linda Unified School District in Sacramento, California, because they believe, the university believes, that is, California University at Fullerton believes, that the school district cannot best train, education students, that is to say, students who are trying to become teachers, in social justice tenets of CRT and gender theories. Can you believe this? So once again, you have this college in California. It's California State University at Fullerton, who's saying that the teachers that they are teaching to become educators cannot be placed in the Placentia Yorba Linda Unified School District because that school district isn't doing enough for social justice, CRT, and gender theories. Think about that. Gender theories, public education, K-12, gender theories. Like, yeah, I have a theory. There are more than two genders. I'm sorry, genders. What? In public? Why is that relevant? And all of this started under Barack Obama. And believe me, ladies and gentlemen, if you can start that early teaching children that there are more than two genders, there's almost nothing that you can't convince people of that is untrue. And this all started under Barack Obama. The same thing happened in my own local government, ladies and gentlemen. On my own local school board, there was a very sneaky 2 individuals on a 5-member school board that they were very actively getting rid of the salutatorian and the valedictorian. And they were just like, it just isn't worth it. There's just too much arguing over who's going to be decided. It's like, and that was their argument. But the truth is, now that I have observed these 2 individuals over the period of a decade, I've realized it was all coordinated by Barack Obama. and all of the Obamaites to get rid of merit throughout public education, which means that the next generation coming up is going to try to get rid of merit in every aspect of society. So no matter what you achieve in society, you didn't deserve that. You only got that because of the way you look. That is what your children could very well be learning in K-12. So in the Daily Caller, colleges chose diversity over merit. Now they're getting neither. So pretty funny, right? So it's all coming back. The chickens are coming home to roost. So since eliminating standardized tests in the college admission process, higher education institutions are struggling to judge applicants. Can you believe how stupid that is? So think about this. We got rid of standardized testing in college admissions process. So instead, we're going to just judge people by, the way they look and their grades in the public school system. So you could be coming from a terrible public school system and be an A student, but effectively fail the college admissions test. Not that there's a pass or fail, but we all know that there really is. And the college education institutions are saying, well, now it's really hard to judge applicants. I mean, imagine that. Quote, it's pure magical thinking to expect good results by eliminating standardized tests. From the start, it's been clear that removing objective tests from admissions would erode standards, and it has, while simultaneously giving a greater advantage to wealth students who can game the holistic admissions. John Saylors said a fellow at the National Association of Scholars told the Daily Caller News Foundation. So in other words, we have college admissions officers who have been told, for whatever reason, again, this all started under Obama, you can't really judge people by the merit of when they apply from high school. So people begin applying to college typically in their junior year, the end of their junior year, by the way. And then the college admissions, the actual notification that you got into the college begins at the beginning of typically it begins at the January of your senior year. And what we're being told is now many of these colleges are saying, hey, we have a lot of students in our college that are actually failing. They're not performing very well. And the reason they're not performing very well is because they probably weren't qualified to be in this college to begin with. And let's find out why that happened. We have remember, these are supposed to be educators. We can't figure out why that's happening. And now, of course, they've decided that it's probably because there's no objective way when you are allowing children or young adults into your college of determining how successful they can possibly be, because you don't have any kind of standardized test, any way of truly and objectively seeing whether they can be successful or not. And look, I know a lot of you out there in Podcast Center are like, well, I don't like standardized tests anyway. You know what? You can get a great education in any one of the schools across America if you apply yourself. And this idea that you didn't get into your first choice, and this is always part of the problem, right? We got to this point today because Barack Obama has convinced the left, and it all started when he was president of the United States, and the left has continued this, and they keep expanding it by telling people the reason individuals aren't getting into college is because of the way they look. And now we're finding out that merit actually matters to the college admissions process because we have so many students who are failing out of college, aren't able to do the work. So colleges that eliminated mandatory testing for applications, went to test optional, are struggling to fairly assess students because they lack standards to judge the applicants, according to a report by Vanderbilt University's assistant professor Kelly Slay. While test optional admissions have increased applications, a lack of academic standards has created a chaotic and stressful process for leading to bias that was intended to be ignored. Exactly. The whole idea of a truly fair application process was to measure people based on merit. And you would have scores, right? We're going to give 50% of the score to your grades in high school and combined with your tests from the college admissions testing. And then we're going to give 25% to character. What have you actually accomplished in your community, and what kind of organizations do you belong to, and what have you achieved while you're there? And we're going to give 25%, let's say, to your recommendations and or maybe just to your own essay that you write. Whatever it is, right? But have it apply the same way to everyone. And naturally, what Barack Obama wanted to do, and which this is why public education, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, is so crooked today, is we now have all of these individuals who have, over the past 10 years, gone to these colleges. Many of them had no business getting in. They graduate from them, and many of them now are in positions of authority, and they're just as stupid can be. And have no business being in these positions that they're in. Well, hey, I graduated from Harvard. Yeah, well, or I graduated from Yale. Yeah, well, you actually know nothing. You know nothing because you got in for all the wrong. So Obama has so corrupted the public education process, and the Democrats are doubling down. And ladies and gentlemen, it all started with getting rid of merit. And the Democrats have decided that diversity, not diversity of opinion, but diversity defined as the way you look, matters far more in a college environment. And so we now have in colleges great diversity, at least by the way people look, but we have no diversity of thought. And then we have no knowledge of how anyone actually got into the college because so many people drop out because there was no standard way of measuring everybody equally. And the Democrats call, by the way, diversity over merit, they call that equity rather than equal opportunity. Just incredible. And that's really where public education is today, at least in higher ed, but also K-12 as well. And it all started with getting rid of the salutatorian and the valedictorian. And so many people were looking the other way, going, it's not a big deal. Doesn't really matter. Maybe change is good. And here we are. It's all blowing up because we have some of the dumbest people getting degrees and graduating and telling us how smart they are because they have a degree. I mean, those are the worst. Those are the worst. So next up, podcast listeners, 8 of 10 say inflation will be the reason they decide to vote a certain way. So we have this issue. It's a big issue, obviously, in the United States now, inflation. And it's understandable because it affects everybody. Here's one of those issues. Doesn't matter how you look. When you go to the store and you pay more for something, week over week over week, keeps increasing, it makes you very upset. And it makes you very insecure about the future of your family, yourself, and of course the country. It also swings you to the point where you might just start thinking about voting for someone different than you would ever have considered before. So Nancy Pelosi, of course, disagrees, ladies and gentlemen. Nancy Pelosi was on NBC, I believe. I have to set this up because we have this clip. I think we have a series of what, Chris? 2 clips here, yeah, with Nancy Pelosi on NBC. And NBC is just so crooked because they're really not interested in getting information. And while you've heard this before, and you've heard certainly me and many others say this before, what's different now, the clips you're about to listen to? Because it's so blatantly obvious. The Democrats are on the precipice of a massive loss. And that's well-deserved. And as far as I'm concerned, no loss in this election would be great enough to send a message to the Democrats. The loss, I'm hoping, is like a minimum of 1,000 seats in state legislatures across America, plus a loss of 50 seats in the U.S. House of Representatives, and I'm hoping a loss of 6 seats in the United States Senate. I think that would be a loss that is sufficient enough for the Democrats to realize that they have really messed up this economy and messed up this country and are not interested in the best interests of the American people. So House Speaker Nancy Pelosi decided that the polls don't matter, especially the polls about inflation and crime, because, people they don't care about that stuff. They just don't. So she was on MSNBC during an interview about a New York Times Siena College poll that shows only 5% of voters ranked abortion as the top issue. Only 5%. More than 26% said the economy was their top issue, with inflation right behind it at 18%. I mean, even that with the New York Times, we all know is a lie, because I'm pretty sure that it's probably 90% of America that cares about inflation and crime. Much of what you said I don't agree with, Pelosi responded after she was asked by MSNBC's Andrea Mitchell the question, why does this matter? It matters because it's not just Nancy Pelosi being obtuse. It's not just Nancy Pelosi spinning. It's the fact that at this late stage in our economy, I mean, we could have a situation in our economy that we go into another great recession. That's entirely possible. And that great recession could be also combined with a war, a major war, which we see in the works now between the Ukraine, Russia, China, the United States, Iran, North Korea, Cuba, Venezuela. Seems pretty obvious to me. A lot of very dark clouds are looming and gathering. So nonetheless, you have MSNBC that is so blinded by all of this activity occurring in international affairs and how it affects the United States and vice versa, and also all of the spending in the United States government, that, you could actually get the situation where the country collapses and MSNBC would be going, make sure you still vote for Democrats. I know the country's going to be fine. I mean, that's how crazy these people are. I mean, there was a time in America when newscasters, even though they always had bias, would still see the writing on the wall that what was happening wasn't good for the country. And even they would come around and start asking the tough questions and, at the very least, trying to hold to account the elected officials who caused the bad things to happen. Oh, no, not MSNBC's Andrea Mitchell. So we have a series of 2 clips here. The first clip is just the question asked by MSNBC's Andrea Mitchell. I mean, she's on NBC too. It's the same network as far as I'm concerned. Listen to her question of how she sets it up, of how crooked it is. Is this a reporter? Is this a newscaster? Or is this an advocate? You decide. Here's the clip. Listen.
So let's talk about rising inflation concerns along with crime, giving new momentum to Republicans after the Democrats were closing the gap, the historic gap.
Yes.
So after the Supreme Court ruling, there was huge outrage. That has seemed to subside, at least among overriding concerns.
So that was an infomercial for the Democrats. So you have Andrea Mitchell's like, oh, it was really good a couple of months ago when the Supreme Court overturned Roe and threw it back to the states to decide what they want to do about the matter of abortion. I mean, Democrat excitement was through the roof and they were ready to make sure no Republicans got elected. But now it's only fallen to 5% of importance. So she's actually upset. Can we listen to that again? Let's listen to this one more time. Listen, here it is.
So let's talk about rising inflation concerns along with crime, giving new momentum to Republicans after the Democrats were closing the gap, the historic gap.
Yes.
So after the Supreme Court ruling, there was huge outrage. That has seemed to subside, at least among overriding concerns.
So the Democrats, did you hear her? She goes, the Democrats were gaining ground. I mean, she was really excited about it, Andrea Mitchell was. The Democrats were gaining ground. I mean, after that Supreme Court ruling, they were gaining ground. I mean, Democrats had already lost ground prior to that ruling because of inflation and because of the endless wars that they seem to be engaged in. But mostly because, let's face it, inflation and gasoline prices, food prices in particular. And also, of course, because of the crazy stuff that's going on in the public school systems and in our colleges. but primarily, the bread and butter issues. And then you have, of course, Andrea Mitchell talking about, and the Democrats were catching up. They were catching. It's unbelievable, ladies and gentlemen. Like if you owned a network, I often thought how fun that would be, right? If you actually owned a network, it would be so much fun to actually have honest reporters on and being super brutally honest to the Republican guests that you have and to the Democrat guests that you had. And when you found that you had a reporter who was crooked, you fire them right away. And you make it a point to demonstrate to all of your other reporters and or journalists that that's what you're going to do if they start playing this little game of advocacy versus true journalism and investigative journalism. It'll be so much fun. That's why, of course, the left is so terrified of Elon Musk buying Twitter, because he actually has an independent mind and an independent thought. He's not on this MSNBC Andrea Mitchell plantation. So you heard the question from Andrea Mitchell. We have a 1.5-minute response. Granted, that's a little long, but it's a 1.5 minute response from Nancy Pelosi. She's rambling all over the place, of course, trying to find a message. She doesn't have a message. Folks, this is what it looks like when you're not just losing really badly, but you have a media that's advocating for you and trying to set you up in a really good way, and you still can't get a message together because you really don't have anything positive to sell to the American people. We have the clip with Nancy Pelosi. Here is her response.
Why do you think the president has gotten this message through the voters?
Well, first of all, let me say that I think that much of what you've said I don't agree with. That is to say, the New York Times poll, I think, is an outlier poll. You cite one poll, but all the other polls.
It's also the Real Clear Politics average is showing similar issues.
No, but that was one that brought down the average, and it was an outlier. It wasn't even that big a sample. So I dismiss that. I've been, since Congress adjourned, I've been in an average of 5 states a week. And I can tell you that women's concerns about their freedom are very, very much still very significant in terms of how they will vote. In fact, 80% of people who care about a woman's right to choose say they will vote, they will determine who they vote for. So again, Washington has always been, the Republicans are going to win, there's no question, for a year and a half. Now that has diminished in terms of that certainty, and there is a real race on, the Republicans are pouring endless money, dark, undisclosed special interest money into the campaigns, but we're holding our own. It's a matter of who turns out to vote. There are issues that we want to fight inflation. It's a global issue. But some of the inflation in our country sprang from the fact that this president created nearly 10 million jobs, at least 9 million jobs, working with the private sector. The private sector creates a lot of that. And when
there's so much there, right? Some of the inflation, Nancy Pelosi said, is a result of the president who created 10 million jobs. Government does not create jobs. Government kills jobs. And then she goes and kind of corrects herself and says, well, the private sector created some of them. But the government, yeah, sure, right. And that is what caused inflation. Jobs caused inflation. So 3 takeaways, because I know we're running short on time, from Nancy Pelosi, just as a reminder to the Democrats. These are all top stories today. In the Daily Caller, very concerned. Biden's economic advisor sounds the alarm over record low fuel stockpiles. So Biden keeps using the government's stockpiles of oil and gasoline to flood the market, to try to drive down the price of gasoline and oil prior to the election. And his top economic advisor is really concerned about it because the reason the stockpiles are there are in the event there's a war or a major catastrophe. Next story. U.S. saw record drop in home sales in September. This is in The Hill. So Redfin says that home sales have just fallen off a cliff. And that's in part because of interest rates, but honestly, interest rates relative to long-term interest rates are still relatively low. Quite frankly, they're still much higher than they were, of course, under the previous administrations. Nonetheless, the issue here is people don't buy homes when they don't have a lot of confidence in the economy or in their jobs. And then the next story. 8 out of 10 say the economy and inflation will factor heavily on their votes. So that's in The Hill as well, The Hill newspaper. 8 out of 10 people say when they go to the polls, they're going to take into consideration primarily inflation. Yeah, they're going to do that. And the economy kind of makes sense. So yeah, Nancy Pelosi, you can get all the help you want from Andrea Mitchell of MSNBC. But since you don't have a message other than Republicans bad, Democrats good, you're going to lose, and you deserve to lose big. And that's it from Mark and the Millennials. Thank you for joining Mark and the Millennials. This is Mark Fisher. Thank you to our producer, Christopher Hopkins. Check us out on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Getter, Truth Social, Rumble, and our website. See you next time.